We are in the year 2009 at the NBA Draft. There are a lot of great players, and even though it's almost a given that the #1 pick will be Blake Griffin, there are other major talents ready to have a future in the league. James Harden, Stephen Curry, and DeMar DeRozan, among others. In the end, Griffin was indeed the #1 pick, selected by the Los Angeles Clippers. The #3 pick went to James Harden, chosen by the Oklahoma City Thunder. And now we arrive at the 4th pick, held by the Sacramento Kings, a team that, as we know, doesn't have a great track record when it comes to drafting. Anyway, Sacramento ended up selecting Tyreke Evans. And now is when the real story of this video begins. It's time for the Minnesota Timberwolves, who incredibly have 2 consecutive picks, the 5th and the 6th, what for many ended up being remembered as the worst draft decisions in NBA history. That year, Minnesota was planning to draft a point guard, since at the time, they had 2 players at that position, Bobby Brown and Sebastian Telfair. Neither player stood out much. Telfair did a bit better, averaging just 9 points, 6 assists, and 2 rebounds. Not bad, but Minnesota wanted to find their next franchise player, their next star. They wanted to take advantage of the draft to get that point guard. Looking at the top point guard prospects that year, there were 2 very clear options. The first was Ricky Rubio, who had been playing in Barcelona and was one of the top Spanish prospects. He was heavily rumored to go high in the NBA draft. Minnesota's second option was a guy named Stephen Curry, who had averaged the following stats during his college career: 25.3 points, 4.5 rebounds, and 3.7 assists. And here, let me make a special note about Stephen Curry and this draft. Let's be honest, everyone who lived through that draft and its lead-up remembers that in 2009, after all the interviews and workouts with different franchises, it really seemed like Steph was going to end up with the New York Knicks. The Knicks had the 8th pick, right after the Golden State Warriors. In fact, even Stephen Curry himself has said, looking back, that he wanted the Knicks to draft him and thought that's how it was going to play out. Even his father, Del Curry, didn't want the Warriors to draft him. He wanted Steph to fall to the New York Knicks. In a conversation with Don Nelson, head coach of the Warriors at the time, Don told him that the plan was for the Californians not to end up drafting him. Then, Curry's father said, "Well, I'll tell you the truth. If it were up to me, no, it's not what I want. But if it's your decision, so be it." A few years later, Stephen Curry recalled what happened on that draft day. "I came to the draft having worked out with the Knicks, but not with the Warriors. In fact, I talked to Mike D'Antoni and James Dolan, coach and owner of the Knicks, and they told me that if I was available at their pick, they were going to take me. So when I was sitting there, I was expecting the Knicks to draft me. Playing in New York was basically a done deal, something I believed was going to happen. But it didn't, and everything happens for a reason. But we're not here to talk about Steph and the Knicks. Let's get back to the Minnesota Timberwolves pick. As I was saying, with the 5th pick in that draft, Minnesota had the chance to choose either Curry or Rubio and feel confident knowing they also had the 6th pick to make another move. As you probably know, the Wolves ended up drafting Ricky Rubio, securing what they hoped would be their point guard of the future for the next few seasons. But truthfully, this didn't make much sense either, since Rubio wouldn't arrive in Minnesota for another 2 years. He was drafted in 2009, but continued playing in Barcelona for a while longer, as he was still under contract. Still, Minnesota trusted him, knowing he wouldn't be available those first 2 years. Now here's the thing. Minnesota still had one more pick. If they wanted to draft another point guard, which was already a questionable move, they could have chosen from players like Ty Lawson, Drew Holiday, Jeff Teague, or even DeMar DeRozan, who was still on the board. Let's remember, Curry had had a strong college career, and it seemed likely that with the 6th pick, the Timberwolves would take him. But what happened? The Minnesota Timberwolves ended up selecting Johnny Flynn. Johnny Flynn? Who is Johnny Flynn? Yeah, I'm wondering the same thing. Flynn came from Syracuse. where he had averaged 16.6 points, 2.7 rebounds, and 6 assists. From the start, his stats were clearly lower than those of Stephen Curry. And now, what happened to his career? Where is he playing now? Because honestly, the name doesn't even ring a bell. Johnny Flynn's NBA career was quite short. After being drafted, he spent 2 seasons with the Timberwolves. Then, in 2011, he went to the Houston Rockets. And that same year, he was traded to the Portland Trail Blazers, where he played only 18 games before being waived. He ended his career playing in leagues in Australia, Italy, and eventually China. Knowing how Stephen Curry's career turned out, we all realize now that the Minnesota Timberwolves made a massive mistake, a huge one, something that, as I said, is considered by many to be the biggest mistake or the worst draft decision in NBA history. Look, Ricky Rubio was good, but was he really better than Curry? And then, with the next pick, when they could have corrected their mistake or even just taken Curry then, they chose a player who barely lasted in the NBA. So now the question is, what really happened? Why didn't Minnesota draft Stephen Curry? Here are some theories, things that are still talked about to this day. Curry explained in an interview why he thinks they didn't pick him. Stephen is a big fan of golf. He plays every week and always finds time to hit the course whenever he has a free moment. What he said was that the information he got was that Minnesota has very cold weather, and one of the arguments the team considered for not drafting him was that playing so much golf wouldn't be ideal. Keep in mind that golf is an outdoor sport, not played in indoor arenas. So Curry, being someone who trained in golf so consistently outdoors, would have a hard time continuing that habit in Minnesota's cold climate, which wouldn't be compatible with the demands of the NBA. Yes, those statements are real. Curry did say that, but I think he said it more in a humorous, sarcastic tone. It seems to me that Curry was adding a bit of spice to the story and throwing a little shade at the Timberwolves for not drafting him. On the other hand, David Kahn, one of the top executives in the Minnesota franchise at that time, gave his version of the story. He said that back in 2009, Curry's agent told him that Steph's father didn't want his son to end up in Minnesota. He said it without offense, as an excuse. That's why Del Curry, Steph's father, asked the agent to help convince the Timberwolves' front office to draft other players instead. Then David Kahn continued by saying that Curry's agent told him he doesn't want to go play in Minnesota. That's what his father told me. And he also mentioned that at the time, there was already a trade plan in place. If the Wolves did end up drafting Curry, he would be traded to the Phoenix Suns at the request of Steve Kerr, who was the Suns' general manager at the time, and who, as everyone knows, is now the head coach of the Golden State Warriors. To wrap up this video, there's no need to even compare the stats of Rubio or Flynn to those of Curry. Just look at this. In his very first season, Curry was already better than either of the other two. And that's not even mentioning what he went on to achieve: championships, records, and all the accolades he ended up earning. Now, this isn't meant to disrespect Ricky Rubio. I really like him, but I think we can all agree on this decision. It was the worst move, the worst draft choice in NBA history. They wasted not just one, but 2 picks that could have landed them one of the best, if not the best, shooters in the history of the league.